It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having me. And this is a special treat for me, actually, to speak at one of Sudhir's conferences, let alone attend his seminar yesterday, because Sudhir has been an idol of mine for 30-plus years, as long as I've been in the business. The story goes, the first day I got in the leasing business, somebody handed me my calculator and then handed me a book, how to use the calculator, with Sudhir's name on it. And about halfway through the book, I was cursing Sudhir for having to learn this information, but I learned to love Sudhir. So I only met Sudhir 4 years ago, but there's some Indian thing going on between us that I think that we probably known each other for 50 years or something like that. So thank you so much for having me. One thing, preface, financial institutions like to have disclaimers. I'll give a disclaimer. I'm speaking today with 3 different hats on. I have the hat that I'm going to speak right now will be from the standpoint of the Equipment Lease and Finance Association. And I will take that hat off and I will then speak as a representative from CSI. But the majority of my topic, I will take that off, and I'm speaking to you mostly from personal experience and from what I know and my personal views. My personal views and opinions are mine, not necessarily those of the LFA, nor not necessarily those of CSI Leasing. My colleague who will be speaking to you later today, Enrique Riquelme, will be speaking to you strictly from a CSI perspective. So I'm going to try and give you a little different flavor as opposed to that. So the Equipment Lease and Finance Association in the United States, we represent close to 600 member companies, roughly 100,000 employees in our industry. One thing very specifically different about our industry, our association, we do not include auto leasing in our association. It's strictly general equipment. So there's no auto lease and there's no real estate in the numbers that I'm going to show you, nor are a part of the Equipment Lease and Finance Association. So strictly general equipment. I also want to preface to say that, just because, we are the largest, I don't mean to speak in terms of being the largest and that we know everything. The reality is we don't know everything, but we've just been around long enough that we've made the most mistakes. So, talk about in terms of our size, roughly $725 billion in new lease originations in the United States in general equipment, and that includes equipment lease and equipment finance transactions. In the United States, we obviously probably as you will have here, there will be 3 sectors that we focus on. One is the captives, which are the manufacturers who have finance arms. We have the banks and the bank-affiliated leasing companies. And we have independent leasing companies, which are of many different varieties and flavors, and with various different niches and specialties in equipment. The ELFA has been involved in our predominant activity for the ELFA is to protect the industry and to protect the member companies. So what does that entail? That entails basically that the association is focused on advocacy. Advocacy meaning we lobby the federal government and we educate our federal legislators about even the existence of equipment leasing. Our senators and our House of Representatives turn over fairly frequently, so the education is an ongoing activity. And the vast majority don't even know that equipment leasing even exists. So one thing I would offer to you, and you can go ahead and click on the ELFA website, if at all possible. But I would like to share the website with you for the sole purpose. There is a wealth of information there. So from a Turkish market perspective, granted, it may not tell you a lot about the Turkish market, but there is a lot of information here about information that we publish, okay, on a continual basis, and the research that also is done. One of the activities of the ELFA, besides advocacy, is research. Within the Equipment Lease and Finance Association, and if you'll click on the research here, thank you. You will see down at the very bottom, the Lease Foundation. Get a chance. Click around on the website. Click around on the Lease Foundation. The Lease Foundation is the research arm of the Equipment Lease and Finance Association. I've had the pleasure to be on the Board of Trustees for the foundation as well, and I'm currently still on the Foundation Research Committee. So we're involved in doing much research relative to the industry. We focus on equipment category research, trends in healthcare, let's say, healthcare equipment. And we try to do our studies that are roughly 3 to 5 years in value. Okay? So we'll focus on the construction sector, we'll focus on the transportation sector, and we'll break the transportation sector down even further by different types of transportation. So you will find a lot of information there. Some of the information, the studies that we publish, you can purchase. Others are free. One in particular is our economic forecast, specifically for the equipment lease and finance business in the United States. And that's relatively new. It's only been around for about a year and a half. We have an econometric company we work with that is specifically focused on net business, fixed investment, and equipment leasing of the various categories, the drivers in each of those categories of equipment types. And that, by the way, the forecast is free. So the Turkish Leasing Association is welcome to take a look and plagiarize all you want. So you can go ahead. So talk a little bit about in terms of the segment leaders in our industry in the United States. And this is a publication that comes out every year. It's called the Monitor 100. It ranks the top 100 leasing companies in terms of annual new business volume and assets under management. Okay? So let's take a look a little further. And you'll see that U.S. bank and affiliated banks, top 5, represent about $104 billion of originations on an annual basis, or 31% of the total. Okay. So we'll now go down to the captives. Captives, of course, names that you all completely recognize. A category that is relatively nondescript. NEC means not elsewhere classified, so companies that don't necessarily fit in one classification or another falls into something in the middle, and typically has something to do with insurance or insurance-like type companies. And then we have the independent leasing companies. You see the kind of the size there. And foreign affiliates, obviously, the like of London, Siemens, and a new entrant, by the way, is Element Financial. This is a relatively new entity in North America. If any of you have ever heard of Newport Equipment Leasing in the United States and Canada, it's a Canadian operation. The gentleman who was running that organization some 30 years ago has got back into the business in a very, very big way and is acquiring leasing companies in North America rapidly. And it's fairly sizable already. Within not only a year of existence, it's already at $288 million in originations on this year alone, or last year alone, excuse me. So, give you a feel. In terms of equipment, you'll notice our largest are transportation and technology, or computer equipment. The other largest is a special sector called Other, which is everything else. So it can mean all types of equipment, but those that are not necessarily classified. But it'll give you a feel for the types of equipment that we're involved in. One thing the ELFA publishes a monthly lease and finance index. It's an index where we pull roughly 30-odd leasing companies of all different types, and we ask them some very specific questions relative to the new business volume that month, the delinquencies, and charge-offs, losses. And we track that. And this particular index is picked up in the United States now by the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, and a number of other publications, Bloomberg. So when this data comes out, it is now being picked up by all of the news outlets in the financial news outlets in the United States. So it's pretty impressive, the fact that the equipment leasing industry in the United States is now coming more to the fore. Here's some of the metrics through the cycle that we thought you might find interesting. On the far left, first quarter 2006, all the way through the worst of the debacle of the financial crisis. And one thing you will find and many of you may not have known this, but we started feeling the problems and seeing the problems very early in 2006 in terms of delinquency and in charge-offs. Things started to go bad rapidly, but even while we started seeing the delinquency and the charge-offs, the new business volume over here, okay, new business volume continued. Not a good thing. So in retrospective, it's easy to say that. But we should not have kept doing as much business as we were doing. But nobody knew the extent of what the problems really would have been. And they were very significant. Today, we are sitting at the first quarter 13. I can honestly say that we are back to where we were pre-recession in a lot of categories. And you'll also notice that the charge-off aging receivables has come down dramatically, but also the losses have come down dramatically to where they were at pre-recession levels and even a little below pre-recession levels. There's a lot of reasons for that, but beyond the scope of this conversation. I have my druthers about my ideas about that, but it doesn't matter. The equipment finance volume, return to pre-recession levels, again, this talks about what the volumes are. And up this line up here is talking about net business fixed investment. So as a percentage of equipment sold in the United States, what percent is leased? So it's a relatively significant percentage. And you can see these are the forecasts that Global Insight is projecting where we're going to go in the United States alone. So I'll now take off my ELFA hat and I'll put on my Bob Rinaldi hat. So these opinions are strictly mine. But there are two operating lease models in the United States. And obviously, as the Turkish leasing industry matures, you will start probably moving in some of the same directions. And clearly, a lot of my colleagues in Europe, they do the same thing already. But there are two different models. And let me kind of ask the question of the audience. There's lessors doing operating leases and operating lessors. Who can tell me the difference between the two? Sudhir?
It's for them to answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
The first one is basically like a dry lease, and the second one is like a wet lease.
Like a what?
Wet lease.
Service bundle.
Close.
I would say that lessors doing operating leases is that they do it opportunistically, and thus it's not their dedicated business, and operating lessors means that that's their core business.
Yeah, so let me explain what he just said. Operating lease, and that's correct, Enrique. Lessors doing operating leases, the leasing companies are not necessarily specialized in a particular asset category. They do those leases opportunistically as they arise. Whereas the operating lessors are very specific on an asset category and make a market in that business. So there are very different distinctions here. And how they go about doing operating leases are very, very different. So let's talk about lessors doing operating leases. The types of leasing companies, it's all three. Banks do operating leases, captives do operating leases, and independent or privately held companies do operating leases. Okay? The majority of these lessors are general equipment lessors. And what I mean by general, they do all types of assets. One thing you also find with many of the lessors doing operating leases, they will typically have a department called an asset management department. And the talent in that department is focused on all types of equipment. They do research on many types of equipment, and they keep statistics on that equipment. They keep tabs on what's going on, equipment category by equipment category, industry sector by industry sector. They're real professionals. In the Equipment Lease and Finance Association, we have a whole group as a committee just devoted to nothing but equipment management. So Equipment Management Conference is held once a year, and that committee goes throughout the entire year and does studies and analysis, and they provide once a year a report that they present of what's hot and what's not. So, as I said, the majority are general. That doesn't mean that's always the case. And a minority of these lessors have some specialties and niches. For example, CSI. So lessors doing operating lease, what do they look like? Classic operating lease structures Typically, I know Sudhir was talking about 12 months, greater than 12 months is typically a lease. I would tell you in terms of operating leases in the United States, we don't typically see a lot of 12-month, 14-month, 20-month. We typically see shortest term operating leases, 24 months. And that would be typically technology. It could be forklift and the like. They typically are fixed rate. Means during the lease term, the payment will not change, regardless whether interest rates go up or down. And the residual investment typically is greater than 10% to qualify, obviously, as an operating lease. In many cases, depending upon the asset category, it could be as high as 25, 35, 40%. If it's corporate aircraft, it can be even greater than that. Again, we do not do auto leasing here. From the important distinction here is that the equipment suppliers, the sellers of the equipment, obviously want to book a sale and take revenue recognition on day one of the sale. Hence, the lessors doing operating leases do everything they can to make sure that there are no further encumbrances by the equipment suppliers to the lease contract so that the equipment supplier can book revenue recognition in a sale. Okay? That's a very significant feature that will differ dramatically when we talk about the other type of leasing operations. So operating lessors. Operating lessor makes a market in a particular niche or an industry vertical and typically have value-added services. Now, the types of operating lessors, they're the same with the exception of banks. Banks cannot necessarily participate and can't be involved in some of the functions of an operating lessor. Now, you might ask, well, what are those types of functions? Well, an operating lessor might have a maintenance facility. Most do. Operating lessors are in the business of buying used equipment and buying new equipment and selling both new and selling used. A bank can't necessarily be in that business in the United States. So we do have a few captives that do enter into this business of being a true operating lessor, but as you might expect, it creates a little bit of a problem for revenue recognition. Okay? Some captives, I gotta be careful how I say this, some captive lessors have decided to start taking a portion of their business and moving along the lines of an operating lessor and to take revenue recognition through installment of over the term of the service contract or the contract they're placing when they have ongoing performance obligations. Most of these operating lessors in the United States do tend to be independent and tend to be privately held. Not all. So what are the lease structures? Obviously, just like the last slide I had on lessors doing operating leases, classic operating lease structures, greater than 24 months. But I would tell you they also then do rentals. And rentals can be sub-24 months. They can be 20 months. They can be 18 months. Very customized to what the customer wants. The rental agreements could be 36 months. It could be 60 months. But the rentals include service, usually, of some portion. And some ongoing obligations and involvement by the operating lessor, customized to the needs of the customer. Very different. Managed services, you may or may not have heard of that in Turkey, but that will come. Managed services is kind of a hybrid between an operating lease and a services contract, where the finance company, the leasing company, will enter into a lease typically with the supplier of the equipment. The supplier of the equipment will bundle that equipment along with a package of services and enter into an agreement, separate agreement, managed services agreement, with the end user. Okay? So you have to kind of think about what all that really entails. And then there are various permutations of that on top of all that. It could be just a straight up managed services agreement where the leasing company will actually do the lease but embed it within the managed services agreement, even realizing that there's ongoing performance obligations, and instead have the supplier of the equipment provide warranties, representations and warranties relative to performance. So in the event there's a performance issue, that the supplier will make the leasing company whole. And typically those are only reserved for the most well-heeled and the most financially stable vendors and suppliers could survive that kind of a structure. Okay? Obviously, when you have that structure, revenue recognition for the supplier is a problem. And some are okay with that. So operating lessors make a market in the equipment. As I said, they buy, sell new and used equipment. They maintain, they recondition, they reconfigure equipment. They might get a forklift in that has certain features and capabilities that may not be necessary for another user. They may change it and make the modifications and then go back out and release it to a secondary user and a tertiary user. Revenue recognition, as I mentioned, on the total sale price to them, it's not that vital. So, give you some examples of lessors doing operating leases. CSI Leasing, one, and here's a link to their website. I've listed them all for you, so when you get the copies of the presentation, you have it. But I've made a few screenshots, and we'll take a look at some of those in a second because they're kind of interesting. You'll see them. Somerset Capital, both CSI and Somerset are independent. PNC Equipment Finance is a bank. And they have specialties in IT, golf, and healthcare. And that was a place that I resided prior to coming to CSI. PNC purchased National City Equipment Leasing, National City Bank, during the downturn in the financial crisis that we had. Operating lessor examples, Chicago Freight Car Leasing. Again, just focused on one asset category, rail cars. They rent rail cars, they lease rail cars. They buy used ones, buy new ones, they sell new and they sell used. And they bundle transactions and leases as well. Med1 Capital out of Utah in the United States is focused on healthcare primarily. Infusion pumps. They rent infusion pumps to hospitals and nursing clinics. They will rent them on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. They will lease them for a longer term basis. They will rent them with full service for a longer term basis. Very different. FCM Rail, I don't know if you've ever heard of maintenance of way equipment. Maintenance of way equipment is equipment that does maintenance on rail, on a rail infrastructure. That company, very specific in what they do. We looked at, many years ago, purchasing them when I was at National City. They were subsequently purchased by Caterpillar. So here's a couple slides, real quick. And one thing you'll see about CSI Leasing, focused on technology. Market a specialty, if you will, for us. That's the majority of what we do. But there is some, we do some healthcare. We also do some medical equipment and government and education in the United States. So we have 3 or 4 specialties. So we do operating leases in those specialties. But we don't make a market, for example, in media or in healthcare equipment. We don't buy them. We don't sell them used. We don't reconfigure them. We don't rent them. And we don't service them. Somerset, this is another independent. You'll see that they're focused on material handling equipment, technology, power systems, and ground support equipment at airports. Okay? So they have 4 specialties. So they have to know something about 4 different asset categories. PNC Equipment Finance, you get a chance to click on that. You'll have to do some clicking down below. But bottom line, you'll see some of the sectors that they're in. There are more down below this if you scroll down. One of the things that we did at the bank before we were acquired by PNC is we really did focus on creating market niches in roughly a dozen categories. Focus on every one of those, and we had experts in every one of those categories. And our asset management department was very competent in all of those areas. And if they weren't, they had to learn. So Chicago, this is an operating lessor. As you might specifically see, this is all they do. Again, go to their website, get a little bit of information about how they go about doing business and what they do. I talked about Med1. So you see down below, lease and finance, equipment rental, equipment sales, and hospital services. Do a number of things in one vertical. So they actually do make a market in a particular asset, and they're probably one of the largest buyers of infusion pumps from the manufacturers in the United States. I think they probably own 20,000 pieces of infusion pumps across the U.S. And I talked about FCM Rail, which is now under Caterpillar, strictly focused on a very unique category and a very big niche for them. Okay? And very defensible niches. So why do you create all these niches? Why do you focus on one area? It's because it's very well protected. They have no competition for the most part. As well as some of these other ones. FCM Rail really has no competition. They don't have to worry about banks getting into that. They don't have to worry about other independents. The cost to do that would be very prohibitive. Okay? Although everybody's still going to compete with General Electric and others. So what does it take to succeed in the United States? Well, let's forget the United States for a second. In terms of Turkey, if you're looking at that, to decide in terms of operating leases what you want to do from a bank perspective, the way I see it personally, this is just my own opinion, depends how big you want to be, the size and scale. Depending on how big a bank leasing company wishes to be that portion of the portfolio being leasing, that will dictate what asset selection. Okay? The risk level that you're willing to tolerate, default, delinquency, all those things that you will have to answer on a monthly and quarterly basis to when you're presenting, the head of your leasing operation has to present to the bank. What can they tolerate? That will determine your industry selection. From an independent standpoint, very different here. The availability of equity on the balance sheet. How much cash and working capital do you have? Will determine how much operating leasing you can do and in what asset category you can do it in. Right? For example, easy example. If an independent wanted to start leasing locomotives, a locomotive might cost $20 million, $10 million, let's say. Well, if it's $10 million, you're going to make an operating lease of 25% residual, probably greater than that. How many of those deals can you do before you have no more capital? Probably one or two. So that's probably not a good market if you're an independent. However, office equipment, technology equipment, you can. Okay? You only have to maybe put 10% in. So you can do a lot more. You can stretch your dollars. And in terms of shorter, which means you can recoup your investment in a very short, much shorter period of time. Roughly 24 months, 36 months. Capital comes back in, you resell the equipment, you remarket the equipment, you get the capital back, you recognize your residual, and now you go forward and do more leasing with that same dollars. Okay? And you do what you know best, and if you don't know it, you better learn it. And so that's kind of the story for the two models in the United States as I personally see it. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
We'll take questions later on. So please join us here. Thank you very much. Insightful. Your comments at the onset about our relationship were appreciated. The landscape you painted about the American market, the two models, which I myself have never heard with such clarity with respect to operating leases, were also appreciated. One thing that Bob did not mention when he talked about ELFA is that ELFA, the Equipment Leasing and Finance Association, also accepts international members. And for those,
That's correct, we do. We do take international members.
just spend 15 seconds on it, if you don't mind, just telling them the benefits of an international membership in ELFA.
Yes, international members, the cost is very nominal, really. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but certainly less than $10,000. And you then get access to much of the information. Your employees, the entire company that you're with, can have access to all of the sites, the places within the ELFA website. You are invited to come to the annual convention and all of the conferences that we hold. And if you go to the website, you will see many conferences that are held throughout the year. Everything from credit and collections conference to asset management conference and the annual convention, which is the largest, which happens usually every mid-October, and there's roughly about 950 attendees that are all leasing companies. And again, no auto lease and no real estate. So people doing what you do are at this convention. So it's a great way to network with them, a great way to meet people. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Ian, hate to get you waiting there, but I'm sure standing is better than sitting anyway. When I met Ian last year at the Operating Lease Conference, I immediately knew that I was going to ask him not only to speak at this conference, but ask him to be on the advisory council as well. And he helped me select some topics, get some speakers, and I appreciate that. Ian has made a move recently from Delaga London to a consultancy firm that he'll talk about, I hope he will, that is based in the UK. Ian has experience in leasing with Siemens, with CIT, with Dell, and lately with DLL. What he's going to talk about has to do with asset lifecycle management, which essentially is a win-win-win for the lessor, the lessee, and the vendor. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Sudhir, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And special thanks to Bob for the last half hour, which to my ears was just a big advert for asset management. So thank you for that. I'm going to spend, Sudhir intimated, I'm going to spend the next half an hour or so explaining what lifecycle asset management is. And in particular, I'm going to try and draw out the enormous benefits for the three parties that Sudhir mentioned. For the end customer, that's absolutely vital. For the vendor finance partner, if you're in the vendor financing model, and ultimately for the community that's represented here today, what's in it for the lessor community. So the agenda is a little bit of definition and introduction on what it is, because many different people have different perspectives on what life cycle asset management is. So I'm going to briefly define that. Sorry. Okay. So I'll define that from my perspective. And then, as I just said, I'll take you through what that potentially means for the different parties involved. And ultimately, I took liberties with the original title, which was win-win. How do we get to a win-win-win, which is the ultimate position if we have a vendor finance model. Okay, so before we do that, Sudhir's already done a great job of setting me up, so I won't spend too long on this. This is my personal career background. As Sudhir mentioned, last stop was at Delaga London, where I had the good fortune and privilege to head up the asset management as a marketing function. As Bob rightly said, really crucial to have asset specialisation, and DLL, like the other businesses that were mentioned, very selective on the number of verticals that it played in, and really ended up with to my opinion, very specialised, high-quality people, and that's, if you hear nothing else about from this presentation, take that away. The asset specialisation is absolutely vital. And I stepped out of DLL in the summertime, and as Sudhir mentioned, I'm now part of Invigors. And what I'm doing there is leading the asset management practice. And the, if I can get the clicker, there we go. That's really the mission, is to help captives and the lessor community generate enormous value by understanding the assets themselves and exploiting their potential. So, LCAM, shorthand for lifecycle asset management. So, a bit of definition. Yeah, it's a different thing, I would say, in different industries. You have different services that are relevant and different topics that particularly strike a chord in certain collateral classes. And indeed, in certain markets, what's applicable in one geography will not necessarily be applicable in another. And I think as has been well covered in the earlier discussions today, Turkey's probably a market that's not ready for all of these services yet, but to Bob's point about managed services, that's something that will surely come in due course. One thing I just wanted to focus on is the concept of unlocking value, and I'll go into a lot of detail on this shortly. And how can you do that? And one really important point to draw out here is that you're not only potentially extracting value from looking at the first cycle of equipment usage, you're trying to look ahead and see how the equipment can be reused and redeployed and perhaps broken down and used in a second and even a tertiary cycle. And for people who think that process through from the outset, they're able to potentially crystallise that benefit in the form of a residual value on day one, so monetising that benefit and potentially passing on some of that benefit to the end customers. Another thing that, again, this is probably talks more to the vendor finance model than the direct leasing model, but it's also relevant to the direct model too, is actually appreciating the value of the customer socket. And more businesses, whether that's a life cycle management business or whether that's a manufacturer's business, they're getting more and more money, not just from the asset themselves, but also the products and services that go alongside that. So that could be from, service and maintenance revenue, it could be warranties, it could be consumables. So from a manufacturer's perspective, actually having greater control over the customer socket gives you great potential to add on these value-added services and products. So that's really addressing the point that I just made. And I think I won't belabor this point. The asset management knowledge is absolutely essential to make this happen. So this is a picture really just trying to represent the leasing cycle itself. So I've deliberately shown, I don't know whether you can see it from the back, lease inception as even embryonic stage, where some lifecycle management companies will help people in their purchase decision, so even prior to the lease commencing. Mid-term management, by that might be fleet management and actively advising customers what their optimal structure of equipment could be. Might also be activities around prior to the end of lease, where you're helping customers upgrade their equipment, maybe taking some equipment back and replacing it with others, or upgrading the equipment to a greater level of performance in situ. Redeployment I'll come back to in a second, and then the last part of the cycle is actually equipment disposal and scrapping. But redeployment I will come back to now. And redeployment options include, and I think Sudhir mentioned this earlier, obviously one of the most common things that happen at the end of an operating lease is a lease renewal, and that can be fixed term, it can be month-to-month renewal. And for a considerable number of collateral classes, that's really where a huge amount of money is made and the residual value is recovered. Could also be a remarketing event, so physically selling the asset, that might be to the original lessee, it could be to a third party. Inventory financing is common in some markets, so if you have a dealer channel for your used equipment, providing the dealer with some inventory financing prior to them selling the equipment in the secondary market can be a source of value. And typically you will see much higher levels of equipment value in the sale process because you're in less of a rush to sell the equipment. Refurbishment, I'll just draw the distinction between refurbishment and remanufacture because it's an important difference, and I'll talk specifically on remanufacture later. Refurbishment is when the equipment comes back and you will invest some money in bringing the equipment up to a good condition to be sold in the open market. Remanufacturing is a situation where typically the original manufacturer will take the equipment back and will put that through the same quality standards and testing that a new piece of equipment would have. And again, typically the equipment there will go out with an original manufacturer's warranty. And obviously from the secondary market perspective, that goes out at a very attractive price point, but typically it will make a lot of money for the manufacturer and enable them to address a market segment that they wouldn't be able to get to otherwise. And then the last point is really just saying, what could you potentially do with a piece of equipment? And this, again, probably dovetails quite nicely with the topic of remanufacture, where increasingly you see concepts from a manufacturing perspective of equipment coming back and being reused. And that might be being redeployed as spare parts for equipment, or it could even be breaking down components and reusing them in brand new equipment. And there are examples of this from from the copier industry through to high-tech semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And again, done well, it's a huge source of value creation. Okay, so that's a little bit about the, let's say, the touch points you can have in the leasing cycle. I'm now going to look at what can life cycle asset management mean from a lessee's perspective. So what's in it for the end customer? Now, I think Sudhir already outlined many of the typical advantages and traditional advantages of the operating lease product. Low lease price, you hit the nail on the head earlier, it's the cheapest product out there. There's some accounting advantages, which will be covered this afternoon, and maybe some of those are slightly under threat, and again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. Obsolescence management. However, in addition to the traditional benefits, there's a range of, let's say, needs that end customers are increasingly looking to be addressed. And I use the phraseology optimised total cost of usage. And I will come back to that later, so I won't spend too much time now. But really making sure you're not just looking at the cost of acquisition, but you're also contemplating the spare parts that you might need in the future, your maintenance agreements, etc., etc. So understanding truly what your through the cycle costs will be for using that piece of equipment. I think maybe I'll just quickly say something about transparency. Again, I think this differs by market, but lessors who go into virgin markets and just have a perspective that at the end of the lease we can take advantage of customers. I think that works through one cycle, but ultimately that has the potential to cause problems further down the line. And increasingly in the more mature markets, you see that customers get wise to this, and increasingly you're seeing end customers asking for more certainty on what happens at the end of the lease and what the outcome might be for them. And then the last two, perhaps, maybe things you weren't expecting to hear in this presentation, but compliance and sustainability are becoming increasingly relevant topics. You might argue some of them are, sustainability might be a bit of a fashionable topic, but I'll talk to the real strong economic case for that later. And one thing I would also just emphasise, lessors should also be aware that in addition to the changing needs that customers have, the behaviours are also going through change, and I'll talk to that in detail. So very quickly on the accounting changes, and I won't talk a great deal about this because it's going to be addressed this afternoon. I think it's fair to say there is uncertainty ahead, nothing's definitive. But in that being said, even if some of the proposals go ahead as they are drafted at the moment, there are still advantages to having an operating lease structure. And the residual will provide some additional benefit, but again, that'll be addressed this afternoon. Managed services, which Bob talked to, can also provide the end customer with continued off-balance sheet advantage, so something to pay attention to. Compliance, I promised I would spend a few minutes on, and not perhaps the most exciting topic to talk about, but it is an important one. It has the potential to present real business risks to both end customers and to the lessor community. So you really need to be aware of what you're doing in this domain. And in addition to potential direct economic harm that can come to the lessor's business, I think the more important issue is probably reputational damage. And if you think through some of the topics in particular on the compliance side, data deletion is probably one of the more important things from a reputational damage perspective. If I just give an example, many photocopies these days have local memory sources, and very, very often when photocopies are returned, they'll not go through a data destruction process. So if you have clients operating in a sensitive environment, government, healthcare, legal, some of that has a potential to end up in the wrong hands, and it's something to be aware of. The other aspect which I'll quickly talk about is export compliance, and again, it's maybe a dry topic, but it's an important topic to understand. US export law compliance reaches its hands out all over the world. It's not just a topic for US lessors. It is an important topic to be aware of and the potential damage. And just in short, you need to know who you're selling to. You need to understand which assets it applies to, and in particular what we refer to as dual use pieces of equipment. And even if you know who you're selling to and have an idea that it might be going to a third party ultimately that might be using it for less savoury purposes, that doesn't absolve you of your responsibility if you put somebody in between. So that was some of the, I suppose, some of the things to be aware of from a lessor's perspective in terms of compliance, but it also creates opportunity because most lessees are not conscious of these issues. So it's something you can sell the benefits of from an operating lease product. Usage is another behavioural change that I think is coming, and it's coming in lots of different markets that perhaps you perceive at this stage it's not really there. And I just put some examples of assets and equipment that perhaps you wouldn't traditionally think an operating lease would apply to. Whether that's having art lease, or whether that's plants and trees that are in the office atrium. These things are starting to be put on operating lease structures. And there's also a generational shift that maybe many people in the younger generation are just more familiar with not owning things. And if I take the agriculture market, that's one that's been a very traditional ownership-driven market, and that at the moment is going through a generational change where the younger generation of farmers are starting to demand the operating lease type product. This is an area of concern, loyalty, customer loyalty in general, both in consumer space and in the B2B domain. Customer loyalty is in decline, and lessees, the end customers, are increasingly concerned about value for money and performance, and that's really the driving feature, and increasingly so these days. And that's obviously being helped by the recent economic climate, but it's a trend that I think is going to continue. Sustainability. I'll put everything up here. The picture which you perhaps can't see there, that's an advert from Mercedes. And Mercedes were just really majoring on the fact that remanufactured components and reuse of existing equipment, it's obvious when you think about it, has a much lower carbon footprint. It also has less impact on depletion of natural resources, which will become, in the long term, an increasingly important topic. It's already very important in certain industries today. And even end customers in some markets are starting to demand, let's say, sustainable solutions. And some of the manufacturers are responding to this by having a remanufacturing model or a reuse and redeployment model that uses used equipment and is able, in that sense, to demonstrate a much lower carbon footprint. So there's a kind of eco story to be sold around that. So this, in summary, are the lessee issues, and maybe there's a couple of advantages on there that Sudhir didn't capture. Most of them were there. I will make one comment on this slide because it's perhaps obvious when you think about it, but one of the benefits, in addition to managing the asset risk from an obsolescence perspective, in addition to that, there's asset risk very much associated with what the value of the equipment is. And I think as an operating lease community, we often don't sell that benefit enough. If we go back to the crisis days, which were alluded to in the charts earlier, in the 2008-2009 time period, you saw equipment values in some collateral classes collapse by 50%. And then recover relatively quickly, happily. But that's real risk that an operating lessor is taking and that benefit should, I think, be more widely marketed to the end customer community. And the happy thing about all the issues on here, there are opportunities characterised there, and there are challenges around flexibility and price focus and so on. The happy thing that I'm trying to explain here is that lifecycle asset management solutions can help address every single one of these issues. So, how do we do that? Some sources of value creation, and I think you all have access to the slides, so I won't go through every point here. But in essence, it boils down to actually what Bob was saying.